Hello and welcome to our session on evolving the plain language summary and creating patient voice publications. We're really excited to launch patient voice publications at the RARE Summit today. Joining me is the wonderful Jess Duggan, who has worked with us on creating these. Now, Jo was going to do the introductions to myself and to Jess, but she's had some technical issues, so I'm afraid you're hearing from me at the outset. It's always a bit difficult to introduce yourself, isn't it? But I'm Emma Sutcliffe. I'm the Senior Vice President at Prime Patient, which is a part of the Prime Global Group. But the story of the creation of patient voice publications, it feels as though it began a couple of months ago, because that's when we started working with Jess and with other rare disease groups. But actually, the reason and the need to create patient voice publications, or a new way for patients and patient groups and carers to tell their stories, actually began back in 2017. So some 5 years ago, when I attended one of the Cambridge Rare Disease Network early summits and meetings. And in speaking with Jo and Jo's team, it became obvious that there really wasn't a way for patients to tell their stories and step away from the high science that we try and do in medical publishing. So from that meeting of frustration, really, back in 2017, what do we do? How do we enable people to tell their stories? This is where the idea of a patient voice publication was first born. So what we're going to do today is present a case study, really, of how we've created patient voice publications. There'll be a short video from Jess and from myself. And what I'd like to invite you all to do is to think about the creation of these, and in three different ways. How do the PVPs benefit patients? How do they benefit Pharma in their collaboration and engagement with patients? And genuinely, how do these patient voice publications benefit the wider aspects of society? So hopefully, as you watch the video, you can put some questions together under those three remits, and we'll have a good Q&A session at the end. So over now to Jo. If you could play our video, we'd really appreciate it. Thank you, Jo.
For patient advocacy groups like the SynGAP Research Fund, PVPs bring huge value. In the first instance, to raise awareness of genetic diseases like SynGAP1 that are really only starting to be diagnosed and are still not well understood in the broader community. And with the wider availability of genomic testing, we will see and continue to see these diagnoses steadily increase. Secondly, we really need to make visible to industry and regulators the hidden cost of these diseases, medical support through the lifespan, EEGs, MRIs, inpatient procedures, psychiatric care, social supports, the need for one-to-one support through the lifespan, both in educational settings and in the community, and the impact on family life. Caregiving in many cases risks the health of the entire family. The divorce rate for families in this community is extremely high. We see instances of broken families and caregivers really struggling to support their families. So amplifying the patient voice through PVPs is really key, because many of our families do not get the chance to speak to pharmaceutical companies and industry. So we really encourage these listening posts as a way to get a deeper understanding of the disease and the burden on the entire community. We thank Prime Global and the Cambridge Rare Disease Network for giving us this opportunity to share our patients' voice, their needs, and the opportunities that we see available for improving their quality of life. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Emma Sutcliffe, and I have the pleasure of leading the Prime Patient Centre of Excellence at Prime Global. I'm going to tell you a story around why we have created patient voice publications and why we've worked with 8 different patient groups to create these, because there's a real need for patient voice publications to amplify the patient voice in healthcare. First of all, I'd like to say thank you. We've worked with some amazing people on this project, and you can see some of the snapshots of the eventual patient voice publications right there in front of you. But I am going to name check the people who have been involved. So I'd like to say thank you to Chris, to Amber, to Nuala and Ophelia, to Sophie, to Mandy, to Jess, to Henry, and also to Catherine and Kerry. We've worked with these guys, and they've helped us to create patient voice publications. They've helped us to innovate and to push forward that PLS. And it's been an experiment that has had great success for us and for the patient groups too. The reason we decided to create patient voice publications is because we do know that actually patients have emotional needs, and they have needs outside of a clinical trial setting. They have needs outside of communicating with their HCPs, and those needs are often unheard and often unmet. We do know that the pharma collaboration that we see is highly clinical. We do know that patients' everyday needs and impact on their quality of life are highly emotional. So we've had a lot of time to think about this and to say, well, how can we actually meet patients' needs and be compliant on behalf of our pharma clients in a way that's more collaborative and more comfortable? So what we did was we approached actually Chris, who was diagnosed with ALS in 2017. We created an abstract with him, and that abstract got rejected. So we said, what's going on here? How can we create patient-authored events, patient-authored publications? How can we create a new system where the patient voice is amplified? And we came to the conclusion that we can amplify them through what we're calling the patient voice publication. So overall, what happens in a patient voice publication is the patients tell their story. They talk about their real-world experience. They talk about the burden of disease and the hopes that they have for the future. So we're trying to bring their voice to our pharma clients to enhance that engagement and make it less clinical, still compliant, and more comfortable. What we learned through this experiment was that patients and the patient voice publications, they really do drive engagement. They really provide better outcomes for patients because they are meaningfully, these patients are meaningfully telling their stories, and pharma is meaningfully listening. So that's the overall experiment that I'm going to take you through, and I'm going to give you a bit more background as to why this experiment and the creation of these PVPs came into play. We, in our role at Prime Patient, our responsibility is to help our clients to have a good, strong patient engagement strategy. And patient engagement has three very clear objectives for a pharma company. It's awareness of their asset, their medicine, their support, activation of the patient so that they feel comfortable in taking on that medicine, that device, that support, and then amplifying the patient voice through the whole system. And we have a very methodological and very practical way of helping our clients to achieve those objectives. And there are certain points when those objectives really come to fruition. And what we also know is every patient engagement program must improve ultimately outcomes for patients. And through our work for pharmaceutical clients with patients, we know that actually every engagement project does improve outcomes for patients. So ultimately, patients benefit, pharma benefit, and society benefits. The greater the collaboration, the greater the patient engagement, the greater, we call it, the triple win. But we have to measure the success of those projects, and every activity actually has a different relevance, and a measurement tool is different to different audiences. So we know within our infrastructure that certain things are relevant to patients, and that's still the social proofing. Certain things are relevant to physicians, and they are really concentrating on the patient activation measure because that's a patient who is really involved and participating in their own care. But then the relevance to our pharma client really sits around the proms and the prems. So what you can see is disconnect already. Patients have one set of criteria around engagement that's important to them. Our pharma clients have a set of criteria and measurement that's important to them. And somewhere in the middle are the HCPs, and somewhere in the middle is the key thing that brings people together. And we do believe it's the patient activation measure. Ultimately, what a pharma company is trying to do is bring these assets, bring these supports, bring these medicines through their pipeline, and they need a return on their engagement. Of course they do, they are a business, But the ultimate thing is that patients and society benefit from pharma providing these great engagement projects. The reality is the experience for patients is still passive. So how do we motivate patients? How do we encourage them? How do we push them up that patient activation measure score? How do we have an overall improvement on the quality of their lives? What we also know is that any system, any engagement project that increases patient activation, that increases the patient activation measure, really does return it provides a good return on investment for all parties. So with that in mind, we've got to embark on patient engagement where patient activation has to be the ultimate end goal. So every single project that we want to commence on has to have that as the end result. So what does that mean in terms of the patient voice publication? Well, we do have something already called the PLS, but we need to be really honest and look at what does and doesn't work about the PLS. So the PLS was first postulated and started to come into practice from 2015. The patient-focused medicine development really provided a clinical trial framework and started to say we need to include patients in how we design clinical trials. Fast forward, and then we have the European Commission, European Clinical Trials Regulation saying, actually, we need to provide a plain language summary at the end of every clinical trial. So we all scrambled together and we all tried to start to produce plain language summaries that then became patient lay summaries. And then in our endeavour to provide good summaries as mandated, we kind of lost track a little bit. So get to 2019 and there are actually 9 different descriptions of a PLS. So a PLS to one person might mean something completely different to another person. Fortunately, there was an open pharma collaboration and a publication was put out just a couple of weeks ago in August 2021 to say, actually, we need to think about what the PLS is, how we publish it and how we distribute it. So the background to this is, again, we have pharma companies trying really hard to produce something that would increase engagement, but the end user, potentially the patient, they were reporting back that actually the PLSers, they're kind of quick, they're kind of cheap to put together, and we're not reading them. So we have to take a really candid look at what does and doesn't work. The rationale for creating a PLS is a good one, was a good one, and remains a good one. But the reality is the PLSs that we have at the moment, they're not really fulfilling the promise. They're not really fulfilling the activation of patients. They're not bringing pharma and patients together in that collaborative, comfortable way. And they're certainly not allowing patients to communicate their everyday needs. So we have some fantastic examples of PLS, of patient infographics, of plain language summaries. They are still complex scientific information or clinical trial data. They are in a clear and concise format, but they are still highly clinical. So this is why we came to a place of thinking we need to increase patient activation and we need to do it through a patient voice publication. The PLS is a highly clinical, dense document. Patients lead their stories based on their emotional needs and the impact on their lives. So the PVP is a connecting tool. It's going to translate patient stories into the kind of language where pharma can listen, and they can listen meaningfully. And what's great about that is this collaborative effort is a great improvement. It's a comfortable environment for all. It actively increases the patient activation measure. And this is why it enhances patient engagement. So they're created with patients, reviewed by patients, and they're actually for pharma to meaningfully listen. We'll talk more in the actual workshop around what was good, what was bad, what was productive about creating the patient voice publications. But here we have the end result. And I do encourage you to go onto the exhibition area and take a greater look at the actual patient voice publications themselves. But what we hear from Jess, who was involved in creating one of these, is that Well, she says very clearly, for the patient advocacy groups, like SynGAP Research Fund, the PVPs have brought huge value. The process in itself has been hugely valuable. If we look at what Chris said when he put together his patient voice publication on life with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, then it was incredible. It's incredible to create these with Chris, and it's an incredible insight for Pharma to truly understand what Chris's life is like. That is the point of the PVP, to help Pharma to meaningfully listen to these patients. And the process of creating them, we're told by these groups, we're told by Chris, we're told by Lynn, is hugely valuable to them. So as an experiment, as a way of turning a clinically dense scientific document into something where patients are actually telling the stories of their everyday lives and Pharma are meaningfully listening, we are really pleased that the patient voice publication experiment has worked. We really enjoyed creating these, and again, we are really grateful to the people that worked with us to create these. So take a look at them and give us some feedback and tell us what you think about the patient voice publication. That's all I had to say right now. But again, I want to give special thanks to Chris, to Amber, Nuala, Ophelia, Sophie, Mandy, Jess, Henry, Catherine, and Kerry. Thank you very much for helping us to create these. So we're back. Thank you for listening to me waffle on during that. Quite a lot that we had to say, because the story of why these have come to practice has, as I said, been a long time in gestation. We've got lots of questions that are coming through, and I'm really delighted. Hello, Carol, a good friend of mine, Carol, saying an excellent initiative, and Carol is one of the people who, alongside lots of others like us, has been campaigning for patient voice publications for a long time. So what I'm going to do now is guide us through the questions, try and keep to the 3 sections that we outlined at the beginning. But Jess, I think probably the first thing to do is to ask you, in terms of creating a patient voice publication, what benefits did the collaboration and even the creation of them bring from the patient group perspective, from the patient perspective?
So yeah, from the patient perspective, well, firstly, I think sometimes it's difficult, as I mentioned in the film, for patient communities to actually have access to pharmaceutical companies in the first place. And sometimes telling their individual stories can, be pretty intimate. And so having this process of engagement with the patient advocacy organizations allows the community to really gather the commonalities in their stories without having to spill personally identifiable information, and have it be presented in a way that change makers, as you said, are actually going to listen and understand the gravity of some of these situations that they're living in.
Yeah, that's true. We're getting so many questions coming through. One thing that really jumped out to me in creating these with patients was, the commonalities. I mean, we worked with 8 different rare disease patients and groups, and what really jumped out was the loneliness that you can feel in not even just in that diagnostic odyssey, but in actually managing this every day. So there's something around that, creating a PVP, either by yourself, telling your story, or aligning with other peers and sharing that story, does start to address one of the key things, the loneliness of a diagnosis. And
yeah, I would agree. So there's the sense that, the scope and the complexity of the situation you're dealing with every day is not fully understood by others. And that's not just fully understood by Pharma, but fully understood by anyone you come into contact with, any kind of professional, teachers, therapists, social supports. It's very hard to continually have that detailed conversation, and that really tries to express the complexity of what you're dealing with again and again and again. And so that's where the publication comes in. It's actually very handy for the communities to have that simplified, simple language, consolidated one-pager to give to the people that they come into contact with, and actually here's the burden, right? Here's the complexities and the scope that we're dealing with. It's extremely valuable.
Yeah. And one of the things that actually Chris describes in his patient voice publication is that when he received his diagnosis, he then had no contact with anyone about it for a month. That's a long time to sit with such huge information. And so I think, what someone like Chris described was he would have liked to have been able to go to hear another patient's voice, to say it's okay to think about the areas that are actually in the PVP, which we should give mention to. The areas include managing symptoms, burden of therapy and life lost, and then what the intention would be in terms of interacting with pharma and trial participation. And then really importantly, it comes back to, okay, well, what are your hopes and aspirations? What do you still want to do, with the life in front of you that is now radically different? And I think actually part of creating these is something that opened my ears, was when Jess, actually, you did say about patients don't really like to think about the burden. This is your life, this is your children's lives and the people you're caring for lives. So even the word burden is something that we need to possibly troubleshoot. Jess, what do you think?
It's kind of, I'm not a rare disease patient myself, my child is, and so when I see the word burden, I love my child, and there are good aspects of life, and there are challenging aspects of life, and so the overall experience I wouldn't always necessarily describe as burden. It's more, how is this impacting areas of your life? And going back to what you just said, is one of the common themes that comes out when you talk to parents from similar other rare diseases is that sense of not being able to fully participate and integrate into the society, that you're somewhat now removed from society. And as you said, just acknowledging that in the patient voice publication is very impactful to the families, that we acknowledge what an impact this is having on your day-to-day life. So yeah, the word burden may be a little bit problematic, but I would maybe replace that with impact. What are you really feeling? How has your day-to-day life changed as a result of this diagnosis?
Okay, we've only actually got 8 minutes, the time has zoomed, so we wanted to have also some questions on the benefit to pharma and also the benefit to society, which you've just touched upon. I'm going to again speak up in terms of what really jumped out to me again in creating these was in terms of the benefits of the PVPs to society. It's devastating. I mean, I'm greatly removed from these other than the creation. But again, what jumped out was just how much people have to experience in society. And some of the PVPs even spoke to, bullying and being subjected to a verbal abuse because they're not quite the same as somebody else. So I am actually genuinely hopeful that the creation of a patient voice publication will also help us to integrate and give insights for people back into society. And that's where we do have to look at the next step, which is how do we publish these? Where do we publish these? Where will they achieve the greatest merit? Because I think the traditional publishing method, alongside the high-end medical journals, it's just not going to work in terms of putting insights back into society. Your average Joe is not going to read the BMJ online. So we really need to think about the broader aspects of publishing these. And I think that comes back to genuinely, how can pharma benefit from these and how can pharma help? So I'd like to kind of bring both of those benefits together in terms of pharma can help by allowing people to create these and to publish these. and to sponsor, you know, the dissemination of these and the distribution of these too. So that's kind of me answering both of those questions at once. Jess, do you have something to say to that?
Yeah, I do. So someone else mentioned in the Q&A, it was Amy, how can we encourage the pharmaceutical companies to commission the creation of the PVPs? And I just wanted to come back to that impact as well. This is translating impact into costs, right? The cost to the patient of dealing with untreated disease is enormous and unaccounted for in most cases. So for the pharmaceutical companies, it's often quite difficult for them to get access to the patients themselves, being so few and distributed throughout the world. And that's where the patient advocacy organizations can step in. You know, that's our job, our responsibility to organize ourselves as patient advocates or patients ourselves. And we often need to produce these artifacts. There is a huge need to produce them, whether it's PVPs or documentary filmmaking. We've also had sponsorship from industry as well. It's been very effective in telling patient stories. That's where pharmaceutical companies can step in and partner with us to help share the family's lived experiences, to explain their impact that will also benefit them. And you know, it brings a sense of partnership, so that when we do move on to talking about therapies, treatments, clinical trials, the community is already engaged with the company, they're already known to the community, and so it builds that reciprocal relationship.
And ultimately, that's what it's doing. So that's what we genuinely learned through creating these 8 PVPs, was that it's not enough. It is just not enough to passively create something. We have to be engaging in these kind of projects, PVP, as you said, videos, etc., that are encouraging people to be able to be active. And that's why it's important to assess and use the patient activation measure, because what that does is it brings all the parties together. It brings the patients and groups together, it brings pharma together, and it brings HCPs into that discussion too. One of the things that really stood out again, and it does speak to that society end question, is just how many procedures and assessments and everyday things that all patients are going through, whatever their rare condition. It's not rare that there's such a volume of impact on society and healthcare costs. Some of these PVPs describe 50 procedures. You know, the number 50 was in one of the other PVPs too, in terms of different kinds of sets of symptoms. So in terms of overall the PVP, we know that they benefit patients in terms of their activation and being able to share information, not feel so lonely. We know that pharma will benefit from listening to what patients' lives are like. And we know that society will start to benefit by just having an understanding of, the consumption and the emotional burden, sorry to use the word burden there, Jess, around life, caring for or living with a rare condition. So I think hopefully this is just the start of the PVPs, and hopefully we get to continue to create them. So we're just at the last couple of minutes. So what I would really like to do is give the final word over to Jess. You created these. You've been highly involved in telling your patient, your carer's story. I'd like you just to have the final word in terms of what you would like to see happen next with the PVPs.
Yeah. So in summary, it's just been a very useful activity to document lived experience. And I just wanted to address one of the comments in the chat that was about, it's not all about pharma. Absolutely. This document can be applicable to many different situations, many different audiences, because it's the consolidation of numerous stories of, this encapsulating the same disease space. So the process of doing that is incredibly valuable to the communities. And that in and of itself should be the reason for doing this.
Okay. Well, we are literally into our very last minute. We've got so many questions that are coming through on the chat and on the Q&A. We will look at those questions, but we do encourage you to go to the exhibition area, look at the 8 patient voice publications, and I'm going to be, from this moment onwards, explaining to my pharma clients that they can use these to meaningfully listen. So hopefully the patient voice publication is the next step in amplifying the patient voice. So thank you to everybody that they're on the chat too. Thank you to all of the patient groups for joining with us on this. And thank you again to Cambridge Rare Disease Network for even allowing us to collaborate with your patient groups. We are grateful, and we are really excited that this is a new era now in amplifying the patient voice. So with that, I think I'll say we're at time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.